Grooming-skandalerna i Storbritannien har skapat stor uppståndelse efter att det uppmärksammats hur politiker och myndighetsanställda underlåtit att ingripa för att offentliggöra nyheten av rädsla för att bli kallade rasister och islamofober. Rebecca intervjuar forskaren Guy Dampier, delskapare av dokumentären Grooming-gängens, Britain's Shame, för att ta reda på vad som hänt.
The grooming-gang scandal itself dates back in terms of detection to about 2011. There was a journalist called Andrew Norfolk from the Times, and he published an article, having gone through court records in the north of England, arguing that there was a particular pattern of crimes that was occurring. And the crime was on-street grooming of girls. Most of the people doing the abuse were Pakistani or Pakistani origin, and the girls were largely white, so it was from one community against another. They were grooming the girls, quite often with younger men, and then they'd make them feel they were boyfriends or that they were friends in some way, bring them in, and then they would essentially hook them in some way, either with drugs, with alcohol, with threats against their families, and then they would pass them on to friends and family, and these abuse networks would then abuse these poor girls extensively. That 2011 article was the catalyst for a series of subsequent investigations, most of which were centred around a place called Rotherham in the north of England. It's a relatively small place. It's about 250,000 people, although a lot of those are actually spread out. So really the centre where it was happening actually was an even smaller population. And the stories that came out of there were pretty horrific, and they involved the council and the police failing to do anything. Some of that was to do with fears about being seen as racist because of the nature of the offending. Some of that was to do with a certain amount of incompetence, that the girls were basically dismissed, they were troublesome, and it was just too much hassle. Some of it, there does seem to have been an element of corruption, of not wanting to look too closely at the community because it would cause all sorts of problems.
Vilka grupper är överrepresenterade bland förövarna av denna typ av brottslighet, och hur pass organiserad är brottsligheten?
They did confirm that most of the abuse was coming from Pakistanis or people of Pakistani origin, which again was a shock because the Pakistani origin community was about 5,000 people, I think, in Rotherham. So if you assume, cut that in half to get rid of the women, you're probably talking about a pool of 2,500 people doing abuse who could have done abuse. There would not be many families in Rotherham that wouldn't have had, in the Pakistani community in Rotherham, that wouldn't have had a connection to one abuser or others. And you can see that when you look at something like Jahangir Akhtar, who was the deputy leader of the council, who was cousins with Arshid Hussain and the Hussain brothers, who were leading one of the main abuse gangs. Now, it doesn't mean he was necessarily implicated, although there were a lot of questions asked, but the fact that the deputy leader of the council could be cousins, even if it was distant cousins, and live, I think, a street or maybe 2 streets away from one of the ringleaders of abuse, shows how close-knit this whole thing could be. The revelation there'd been 1,400 victims was a bombshell. Nobody, not even the journalists who'd been looking at it, had thought it was going to be that high. And that number has subsequently been confirmed. And I believe the current tally is, they think there's about 1,500, 1,510 victims. There were other reports from other places, famously Rochdale as well, where there was a major abuse ring, and also Telford. In Telford there was also an inquiry, and the Telford inquiry, which again, smallish town in Shropshire, not a very large ethnic minority population, and yet the report found it was largely Pakistani origin people doing this, and that there were, they think, 1,000 victims as a sort of like a base level. So it's probably higher than 1,000, but 1,000 is what they feel comfortable saying. This was shocking because it was one group on another, and it was very clear that they were being targeted, to some degree, for their race or for being outside of the community.
Hur pass välkänd var övergreppen inom den pakistanska populationen, och hur reagerade media på den etniska aspekten?
People didn't really want to go near it. It's a very distressing subject to discuss. There's a lot of political controversy because of the issue of ethnicity, and so people sort of tried to gently move on. And there was also, to some degree, an attempt by some people in the authorities and some people in academia to minimise it. A lot of the thorny questions, they tried to sort of defang them. A lot of the debate became about statistics of ethnicity, and it was deliberately confused. So we're talking about a very particular form of offending. It's a form of offending that's in person. It involves members of one community preying on another, and the abuse tends to be shared out with friends and family rather than with, let's say, people who share a similar interest. So you do get white paedophile groups, but quite often white paedophile groups will be people who've connected through the internet. They have a shared interest in this sort of awful abuse. Much rarer to find people who are sharing abuse within a wider family network. Or perhaps the abuse is within one family, but it's not going to go to the cousins and the uncles and everybody else. It's a sort of source of shame within. And so there was a lot of attempts to conflate lots of these things and to defang the issue. And because it's such a controversial subject, lots of academics didn't want to go near it, lots of politicians didn't want to go near it. There's a huge reputational risk. The original journalist from 2011 who'd done a lot of the investigations, Andrew Norfolk from the Times, he came under sustained attack by various activists from the left and various academics. And so people didn't want to get involved.
Hur kommer det sig att massmedia kallar många rapporter om ämnet för desinformation? Guy ger sin bild av massmedias försök att spela ner invandraraspekten.
It's very difficult. Disinformation is a term I tend to be very distrustful of. There's a very technical use of it, particularly when it's used by state actors and the way that the Soviet Union used to use it. That's fair and reasonable. A lot of what people call disinformation is really, I disagree with your view, I disagree with your interpretation, or sometimes it's just referring to people who are making innocent mistakes. So an example would be, what is the true number of grooming gang victims? We don't know, is the honest answer, because there is no single inquiry that's looked into it. We have estimates from the reports in individual areas, but we only really have those estimates for Rochdale and Telford. So that's 1,500 and 1,000. So we know there's at least 2,500 victims, plus all the ones in the other cases. And you'll sometimes see people on Twitter say there's been 200,000 victims, or there's been 250,000 victims, or 1 million victims. Those numbers are, in my view, unbelievably high. But are people spreading those in a deliberate attempt at disinformation, or is it just people who are aware that there is a major crime that's happened, that it involved a lot of girls, and they're just sort of spreading a number? That's wrong. They should try and be more accurate. But I don't really think that's an issue, particularly if it's coming from normal people. Normal people will get things wrong. They're not experts. I think the real danger when it comes to disinformation is the experts, the people who are involved in shaping policy and in shaping the public debate. And when you look at some of those, the people saying disinformation are quite often people spreading disinformation.
Hur har politiker hanterat brottsligheten och i vilket skede är skandalen i?
It's an interesting question. I think in 2014, one of the differences was that there was a much more, the horror that people had because it was so fresh was newer. So across the parties, there was a much greater degree of unity in being horrified by this. And in fact, some of the biggest, one of the biggest advocates of going after grooming gangs was a Labour MP from the left at that period. There had previously been another Labour MP who'd also tried to tackle this issue. That has changed. And I think, again, it's partly this process of people trying to make the issue go away. Now it's very divided. It's very clearly a right-left issue. We just had a vote very recently on whether or not there should be a national inquiry into the grooming-gang scandal. And the Labour Party, the left, voted against it. There was a whip. So they were told by their leadership, you must vote against this. And on the other hand, the Conservatives and Reform, the right-wing parties, voted to have one. So I think it's become a much more divided, it's become a much more serious issue in that regard. And you've also seen more people on the left who are taking the sort of denial angle, who are saying, we've had these reports, like the Home Office report for 2020, there's no issue there. They're not looking any deeper into it. They're not realising that actually, when you look at the statistics, the conclusions that have been come to are fixed. They've not realised that this is actually an attempt to shape the debate and it's a misuse of the evidence. They're just reacting instinctively. So currently the debate is about whether we should have a national inquiry. We're not going to have one now because it's been voted down. The Reform Party have said that they will do their own independent inquiry. They can do that. There will be major issues because without the backing of being statutory inquiry, they'll have no real power to force any councils to do anything, to give them any information, or police forces to give them information. Although there are things that they can do. There's a lot of evidence out there. You could take what's there, you could reanalyze it, and you could show that there is enough evidence to show that there's an issue, or to get some better estimate. But it would then be a sort of springboard for saying, clearly we can see there's a problem, clearly we can see that this is still going on, we need to have a proper inquiry. So it would just be a springboard for a proper one later on. The big question is what happens now? Elon Musk, who's done a lot of the work in promoting these stories and taking the stories that had come out previously and then like promoting them on X, formerly Twitter. He doesn't seem to have lost interest. He's still tweeting about the grooming gangs. He's still tweeting about the fact that, in his view, the British government is negligent and failing to do anything. So long as he stays interested, I think it will stay a story. I think there is a lot more to come out. There's a lot of stories that have never fully been told, and people are starting to look into this. So one of the things that's happening at the moment is there are court transcripts of these cases, and those are held by the government, and you can request them. It's a slightly tricky process, but you can request them and get the full transcript, but it has to then be transcribed by an official transcriber, which is very expensive because you're only allowed to use the ones that the state picks. So as a result, we actually don't know what happened in a lot of the trials, unless there was a journalist there who reported on it, and in some cases there weren't, or in some cases the trial reporting was quite brief. We don't actually know the details. And so people have raised a large sum of money, they've crowdfunded a large sum of money, and they've started trying to find these transcripts, and they're going to try and buy them and then publish them. So I think when those get published, that could be quite electric. I don't think the story's going to go away. The question really is just what happens. The Labour government that we have at the moment does not want to touch the issue. As far as they're concerned, there was an independent inquiry into child sex abuse that finished a couple of years ago. That's all that needs to be said, even though that independent inquiry didn't really look at grooming gangs. It included them in one thematic report and then barely included them at all in the final report, even though they're the worst child sex abuse cases in Britain in the 21st century. But I think people are very upset, and they're going to keep pursuing the story. And so long as they keep pursuing the story, and so long as it keeps going on, and new cases and new victims are found, it's going to be there.